rested, we'll be in 1 Samuel chapter 13. Before we get started, I just want to say some thoughts on the day yesterday. It was a good day. I'm thankful that our church is doing these things. And other than a few things in your life that we take for granted, I don't know that we did anything more important than we did yesterday. I think it's important to set an example to be able to pass this baton on one day. And if we don't do it and they don't see us doing it, then it's not real. And the application came yesterday. So we come, we get up, we're like, hey, let's go. We hang out, we talk, we cut up. But the work that was done, the teaching and the preparing, everybody had a part. It was important. I mean, we made it fun, but I don't know that anything we did last week was as important as teaching young ones. And I got the opportunity to teach the younger class, and we fell behind half a point. It really bothered me, man. But I was talking to them out there while we were teaching it, and talking to them about reading their Bible, and just even in the young class, they were telling me about struggles they had, and things going on at home, and they have bad days too. So let's pray for them, and we're there for them on those Saturdays. Every one of them were smiling, getting to be a kid. So that's great. All right, that's enough of that. Last week we finished up chapter 12, and it took us a few weeks to get through it, but Samuel was given a warning when we last left off. He said, listen, you asked me to pray for you. I will pray for you. It is my life calling. It is my desire. God has laid this on my heart. It would be a sin against God if I didn't care for you like I should. And then he goes down and he's talking about God's mercy. And in 24, he's telling them in chapter 12, I'm looking at it, he says, fear the Lord and serve him in truth. He says, serve him in truth. Serve him the way he desires to be served. And do it with all your heart, with all your power, with all that God's given you. Do it. But slow down and just consider how great God has been to you. So he's encouraging them. But Samuel, being the man of God, can't leave it at that. He's got to say the truth. And right when this chapter 12 closes out, he closes out with truth. He says, but if you still sin, if you still do wickedly, you will be consumed, both you and your king. The only chance that you have to get through this life is God. That's how he left off. He says, if you fail there, then guess what? You're going to be consumed. And I think last week we talked about consumed may not mean we're struck down. We may just simply be consumed with daily life, with things that are taking our focus off of serving God. So if you're going to notice today, the lessons are going to change from what we've been studying and the mindset. Things are about to take a rapid change. Today's kind of a lead-up lesson for, Lord willing, the next few weeks, but the tone changes. Things are going to change, and for Saul, things are going to change a lot over the next chapter. But even for the people of Israel, there's change coming. And Samuel had warned them of this, so I won't lie to you, I struggled at what angle to teach these next few chapters from, and I still probably don't know yet, but we'll read the first 7 verses and try to get through them today of chapter 13. Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, Saul chose him 3,000 men of Israel, whereof 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash and in the Mount Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin, and the rest of the people he sent every man to his tent. And Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines that was in Gibeah, and the Philistines heard of it. And Samuel blew the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, let the Hebrews hear. And all Israel heard say that Saul had smitten the garrison of the Philistines, and that Israel also was had an abomination with the Philistines. And the people were called together after Saul to Gilgal. And the Philistines gathered themselves together to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen, and people as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude. And they came up and pitched in Michmash eastward from Bethaven. When the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, for the people were distressed, then the people did hide themselves in caves and in thickets and in rocks, and in high places, and in pits. And some of the Hebrews went over Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. As for Saul, he was yet in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. So, we read this, and we recall to memory, as we're studying this, Saul had how many battles under his belt that we've studied, that we can say, we can prove with Scripture? It is one. When God filled him and he went to Jabesh Gilead. So the way I read this, and I'm going to say it now, and then Lord willing we'll prove it in the next few verses. Saul is taking his first steps. I mean, he's a babe. He's the first king. He had no one to look at, but he's being allowed to take his first steps. And so I think of a baby. He's going to take his first, yes, him. He's going to take his first steps. Guess what happens? You're going to fall. That's life. Saul's going to have some learning struggles. Let's look at the obvious things in these first few verses. It says in verse 1, Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel. So we see he had 1 year. Nothing's recorded in history on this first year. It was an uneventful year, we'll say. But then when he had reigned 2 years, so that's saying, okay, so the first year was easy. But when he reigned 2, this happened. Okay, so we're in the second year of his kingship. And when the second year came, Saul chose him 3,000 men of Israel, whereof 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash and in Mount Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin, and the rest of the people he sent every man to his tent. We see a huge... 2 years is a long time. We see a 2-year span, roughly, a year starting a second year, just in one verse. That verse covers a lot of time. It's a short verse. There's not a lot in it, we could say, but it covers a lot of time on this earth. And it does it kind of nonchalantly. So let's look at some of the obvious things. We see in verse 2, Saul chose 3,000 men. 2,000 were with him, 1,000 in Gibeah with Jonathan, and the rest were sent to their tent. They were there to rest, to be at his beck and call. So does anybody else read that and think, how's Jonathan? Where'd Jonathan come from? When we first started studying this, Saul was at young 30s. I think we actually had said 33. So 32, 33 years old. Think maybe we didn't teach something, I don't know, but if we assume that Saul is around the age of 32 or 33 based off what we studied so far, we started in chapter 8, and now we see another 2 years went by, so Saul's in his early to mid 30s, 34, 35 years old. I don't know that the numbers are really important, but we see a son that we learn about for the first time in Scripture leading 1,000 men. How old could Jonathan have been? There's years and years that go by in the Word, and the only way we can prove it is with the Word. But we get this mindset a lot of time that Jonathan and David were the same age. And we're going to study this out, but Jonathan was much older than David. The time here in chapter 13 is thought to be 1093 BC. If you go to chapter 16, when Samuel goes and anoints David to be the next king, 30 years go by. So there's at least, a 20-ish year difference in Jonathan and David's age. 20 years go by. Samuel thought he was done in chapter 10 or 11, and God just keeps using him. And 30 years go by, and he's still serving God as an older fellow who thought his days were numbered. So we understand that folks married young then. They stayed on the farm to work and to help. Probably older ones in here can say they've seen that in their life. It's very well possible that Jonathan is between the ages of 16 and 19 years old in this account that we're reading. thought I'm trying to get across here is Jonathan was very young, leading 1,000 men. We could say he was in his prime. I don't know about that. But God gives character. I want to explain this. Would you guys be willing to follow Reese and Tyler in the battle? If you were, that's a heart God gave you to be willing to be a servant. But I think that God had given Jonathan such character that those men would follow him. In all the times, and Lord willing we'll study it out, but in all the times we read about Jonathan in the Bible, it's hard to find fault with him. He was quite different than his father. I also think, and it's a personal thing that I've said a lot, but each generation we tend to want to do more for our children, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we get a little weaker as each generation goes. How many of us be willing to send our teenage sons to battle? We all grew up different. Not to say the homes we were raised in, but maybe the amount of responsibility that was put on us growing up. Some had more, some caught it later in life. I held a chainsaw at a very young age. I would let my kids do that. Times changed. Kids used to drive tractors in the field. Stephanie's dad was 9 years old driving a tractor while people were planting tobacco or throwing hay on it. You don't see that anymore. Too many accidents happen. Nobody wants that for their kid. But times were different here. You think Saul had any other men he could really rely on? He had to rely on Jonathan. Jonathan had to grow up. All right, we'll come full circle in a minute, hopefully. So let's look at the word now and leave my opinion out of it. That was the opinion hour. Saul reigned 1 year. So the way that reads again, Samuel gave his speech, and nothing's recorded there for about a year. Saul's first year reigning as king was a transition year, I believe. Nothing much happened as far as what's recorded in this book, but perhaps he was able to establish some things and some positions. He was able to get these 3,000 men, plus other men that he sent to his tents. So he was busy doing things. So then we see the call, but in year 2 this happened. So now you know something's fixing to happen. So we read in verse 2, we get the idea of an army. We have 3,000 men, but these 3,000 men were different than those sent to the tent. These were the king's men. These were at his call. They were probably the best of the best that he could find at that time, the ones that he trusted the most. And he delegated them to himself as he saw fit. And that's the demand of the king, right or wrong. Samuel told him it was coming. But these 3,000 men were chosen men of the king. And it was Saul's choice. Why 3,000 men? It was probably normal for kings to have that many men or more as guards or as special servants that as he saw delegated in older times. If we really wanted to know, who knows how many the leader of America has to send out as he wishes. But why would God's king and the people, or God's king over God's people, need this? And the reason I ask that is because we can apply that to ourselves. We surround ourselves with things. Comfort to us on this earth can come in numbers. Comfort came to Saul, I believe, in the amount of men he could put between him and an enemy. That's a problem. Our faith can't be in a job or in a contract. It can't be in a number in a bank account. It can't be in a property. It can't be in retirement. It can't be in insurance. It can't be in things that we think make us strong or harder to get to. It can't be in being prepared for something and having enough bullets to outlast your neighbor. When it's God's will, it's God's will. You're just buying bullets for somebody else at that point. That's reality. But that makes us feel secure. Walking over at night and checking lock the doors on your house, that's fine. But that door's not keeping you safe. God is keeping you safe. Saul had these men, and he took comfort in knowing he had 2,000 men here with him. That's a lot of men. That's a lot of souls at risk. As man, as creator, or the creation, this flesh wears out. Things that men make wear out. You can go buy a new vehicle, and in 5 years it's wore out. We are hard on things, but if it's man-made, it wears out. And yet, as men, we put our faith in man-made things because it brings us comfort and security. And deep down, we know that's not the solution. So we got to learn to let it go, and we got to learn to give it to God. We don't want to lose those things at that. We struggle with, I may have to give this up, even though it won't last. I don't have anything against Saul keeping trusted men with him. But the question I have is, where's Samuel? When we read that, so you got all these men, where's God's man? Where's the man who dictates these things? Samuel counts for 3,000 men by himself. All right, verse 3. Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines that was in Geba, and the Philistines heard of it, and Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, "Let the Hebrews hear." Jonathan attacked the garrison of the Philistines, and the enemies heard of it. You think, it doesn't say it, and I will come full circle again here in a few comments, but who told him to attack? Did Saul tell him? Did Saul tell him not to attack? How clear were those instructions? How about this? Did Samuel say you need to do this? I don't hold Jonathan accountable. But if you look back, we won't turn there, we've actually studied this garrison. It's the same one that Saul went by when he met Samuel going up on the mount in chapter 10, verse 5. It's the same garrison of the Philistines. There was a constant presence of the Philistines in Geba. David actually smote them later in 2 Samuel chapter 5. So my question is what was the point of this attack? Why now? They'd been there the entire time. Saul had been in reign now for 2 years. That garrison had been there for 2 years. Why attack? Why do we do this? Why do we take this job? Why do we make this decision? Who's getting honor and glory in that decision? Whenever Jonathan was told to or not directed to, however you want to look at that, why was he doing it? Was there a threat of danger? Was God going to get the honor and glory? Was Israel going to praise God that day for God had wrought salvation? Or was it going to bring trouble? Well, so we can argue, well, we must take our land. God told us to go and possess it. Samuel knew they were there too. Why now? I think the key we need to remember, and we all know, is do not invite trouble into your life. Don't play with sin. Don't play with temptation. If you know you struggle with this, avoid it at all costs. Don't go around it. Don't think you got power of it. Don't rub elbows with it. Avoid it. Don't play with sin. Don't invite trouble in your life. Things come along, and I look at it like this. The Philistines are there, and the Israelites are uncomfortable with that. They know they're there. There's not a lot of back and forth going on that we can read in the Bible where there's trouble with that. But it's uncomfortable. Oh, wow, they're not not us. That's an enemy. There's things in our life that are there that we know are there, and it's uncomfortable. But guess what? God knows they're there too. God knew they were there. Samuel knew they were there. Saul knew they were there. But God told him to sit and listen. God told him to sit and watch in chapter 12. You stand still, you listen, and you wait on the Lord. I can't hold this against Saul. I don't hold it against Jonathan. I can't hold it against Saul. He's young. He was the first one to do it. He was a trendsetter. He was the guinea pig for the kings to come. He was setting an example like we talked about yesterday, or we said about yesterday. If they followed in his footsteps, would it lead in the right path? Would it be in the right direction? I'm sure he had people in his ear. I'm sure there were those that didn't want the Philistines there. But we see no consent given to the man of God. So I believe this is my opinion again, I believe he ordered Jonathan to do this. And this is why. This is the first time in recorded history that under the rule of the king that Israel went out and attacked. First time. This wasn't a defense. Why would the king not take care of that himself? Chance of failure. It's easier to have someone else fail because it gives you wiggle room. So many times we don't try because we're afraid of failing. I'm thankful that's never been in my personality. I fail all day long and still get up usually. But he sends his own son in to a battle with a garrison of the Philistines. Why wouldn't you take care of that yourself? We fear failure. Everyone in here may deny it, but we do. We fear to fail. We don't like it. It hurts our pride. We often learn from it. Saul could send in someone else, and if the mission failed, he had the wiggle room. He could say, well, I would have done it this way, or I would have waited till night, or there was an easier way. I don't know why he didn't think of it, even though he was directing things. It's easier oftentimes to risk someone else. I don't understand the fact that it's his own son, but again, maybe that's all he could trust. I think if we have an idea, we need to be able to follow it out. I can't come up with a plan for your life. If I have an idea, I need to be able to execute that idea. There's a lot of people, especially this day and time, in this country very specifically, who have a lot of ideas on the way things need to go, but they're not applying. They're not pulling their share. If this was Saul's desire, Saul should have been the one to carry it out. And the only reason I say that is it's the first time they attacked. Second thing we can learn, I believe, is fear is a real thing. Do we let fear dictate our life? Or do we let faith dictate our decisions? Because if we're going to make a hard decision, we fear first, usually. We make, plan A and plan B, and we see good versus bad, and we try to plan and prepare for everything. But fear was the first reason we did that. And then, Lord willing, faith comes along and says, none of this matters. You take the first step, and I'll take care of you. You step out on the water and come to me. But we let fear eat up weeks of our life, and faith came in a matter of seconds. Fear's real. We can't let fear, as men, we can't let fear dictate how we lead our families. Just because it seems safer, just because it seems easier doesn't mean it is. You got to lead by example. A faith over fear mindset. I look at it like this. This is why this coming circle. it's hard for me to ask you to do something if I've never done it before. Had Saul ever attacked an enemy? In Scripture, where do we see where he went out first before Jonathan and did it? Was he asking his son to do something that he had never experienced before? It's hard to lead like that. But we see in verse 3, we'll look at the end of it. Jonathan goes out and victory comes, but Saul blows the trumpet throughout all the land of Israel, saying, let the Hebrews hear. And then we see the next verse. And all Israel heard say that Saul had smitten the garrison of the Philistines. And Israel also was had an abomination with the Philistines. Now trouble comes. They're found to be the enemy of the Philistines. They're at odds. And the people were called together after Saul to Gilgal. So a couple things happen in this verse. First of all, the trumpet's blown, the word spread, the rumor spread. It's a rumor. King Saul's given credit for it. That's fine as far as along the lines of a king and a servant. But as far as a father and a son, I have issue with that. If the king gets hey, look, you picked the 3,000 men, you set all this up, you told them to attack, that's fine. You got the victory. You're the king. But the father would want to see the son raised up. So I look at it like that. I look at it where the father took credit for something the son did. But Israel hears of the victory. They're a stink. They're an odor now to the Philistines. And the people are called together or summoned together to Saul. So guess what? Saul took victory. And he said, listen, we won. And the enemy comes. And now Saul's having to call these people out of their tents. But Saul took credit for it, and the Philistines also heard that Saul took credit for it. So they don't go to Jonathan where the fight was. Now they're marching to Saul. So Saul invites this on himself. Application. Be careful for the things you invite in your life. Be careful the lies you tell because it gets you into something you're not ready for. Saul got caught in a lie. He wasn't ready for it. If he was ready for it, those men would have never been sent to their tents. They would have been waiting for that fight to come back to them. So now Israel's found an abomination or at odds with the Philistines. So we look at it as Saul lied, Saul deserved it, the end result's the same. And a few Sundays ago we read the verses of when David came back from war and he was weary and the women and the children were gone. David stopped in that moment to pray, shall I pursue this troop? Will you give me victory over this troop? We don't see any of that here before they go and attack this garrison. See no evidence of Saul doing this or considering God's will. God has a will. We got to pray for it. We got to ask for it. The hard part, that's the easy part. The hard part's waiting on it. God's will has God's timing attached to it. We see after Saul gets their attention, the Philistines hear of it. Saul catches wind of it, and then Saul calls the troops back that he starts to prepare for the repercussions of his act. We do this all the time. We might word it different. We might call it out. It's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission with certain people in our life. But now, after this happens, we see the results. We hear the backlash, and we start doing damage control. It's like, oh, I did this. I got caught doing this. Now I have to do damage control and try to fix it. That's what the king of God's nation is doing. He's doing damage control for the decision he made. If he was ready, the truth is what he should have done was had them ready before he sent the attack. He should have had those men out of their tents. He's still learning, and it comes at a cost. You know the difference is he's having to do damage control, but when God has a plan, God takes care of the details. You ever had something in your life that was so hard, you're like, there's no way I can climb this mountain. There's no way this is going to work out. There's no way I'm going to get over this in my life. This right here will follow me around for the rest of my life. I will be dealing with this. And it's like God rolls out a red carpet and an escalator, and it wasn't anything. But it's because it was His will and His time. If it's God's will and God's time, we don't have to do damage control. That's not to say problems aren't going to come. It's not to say we're not going to look back and doubt it, because that's what we do. But God got us through it, and He made it easy. But it was His will. If things seem unorganized in this decision that we're making, if we're having to do damage control, if there's confusion, who's the author of that? Is that God's will? I mean, that should throw up a flag on our life right away. The Philistines had numbers, and they had an army waiting. And they're in the land, they're in the area. Saul knew it. He walked by them. And yet he's bold enough to blow this trumpet to declare a victory. And in doing so, he's asking for a fight. He's asking for a response. But guess what? Just like us, most of the time we're not ready for it. We think we are. We think we've planned it out to the point it can't fail. We have plan A through Z, and we start over at double A, and then all of a sudden all of our plans are exhausted, and guess what? We got to hit our knees and repent. We're not ready for most of the time we're not ready for the things we invite into our life, but are we ready for the things that we ask for? If you're going to pray it and ask for it, are you ready for it? Saul intended the Hebrews to hear, but the enemy heard as well. You know, the thing about this, about a lie, about what he done here, you get one chance a lot of time. If you ever get caught in a lie, nobody trusts your word again. It's not that I don't forgive you, because I'm commanded to. It's that I question your word moving forward. Don't, you got yourself into this. Well, I don't know if he's telling the truth. That's your king. He's going to send you out. Oh, it'll be fine. The battle's ready. Samuel's come. It's fine. If I can't trust you and you're sending me in the battle, we got a problem. If I can't trust you and you're the king of God's people. I almost said that wrong. You're the king of God's people. That's an issue. Saul was going to have a problem moving forward. Now they're going to have to try to decipher the truth. You know, I think one of the biggest fears about being a liar or telling a lie is we should fear that our words will lose weight in our own home. Jonathan knew what happened. We saw Jonathan and Saul's relationship later in the Bible. Everyone knows that. If you can go in your own home and your word don't carry any weight, there's a problem. Something's got to get right. You got to prove yourself again. So verse 5 is an uh-oh verse. It says, and the Philistines gathered themselves together to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and the people as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude. And they came up and pitched in Michmash eastward from Bethaven. I can see this in my mind. The Philistines get it together. And for one purpose, they're going after Saul. They're coming after Israel. That storm in life right there had a goal. And it was to destroy and to cause disarray. But it was a storm that was invited. There's big numbers mentioned. 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and people as sand on the seashore. You know what I take from that? It was organized. They weren't just wandering around like, oh, where's Saul? I think he's over. They were marching with sound, with a goal. That was intimidation. It was organized. They're not wandering. They are marching in order with a purpose. And they arrive at Michmash. Some things we know about armies. When armies move, they make noise. Sound can be a scary thing. We used to have horses in the field beside us, and every now and then there was like 6 of them. And when they got to running, I'm going to tell you right now, I could feel it at the house. It's a 1,000, 2,000 pound animal beating the ground every time it runs. You know it. 6,000 horsemen, 30,000 chariots. I think the ground was shaking. It got their attention. It brought, the sound alone brought fear. The people knew they were in the land. You know they had scouts. Scout's job, where's the enemy? You're on constant patrol. The scout, hey, you know where they're at. You heard it. I don't even have to tell you. They are here. But I'm going to tell you the worst part that they're here, they're organized. They got it together. We see specific numbers. But in the last chapter, God told them to listen, and they didn't. And then God told them to see. They hear it, and they're fixing to see it. To see this has to be quite a scene. I can't imagine having a vantage point high enough to see this much infantry moving. The Philistines were a formidable opponent. They were organized. And now there's one come and go. You know, a lot of men, if you read about this, think that the Philistines had allies, that there were those just laying there waiting to attack God's people, that they couldn't have got it together this fast. But other people heard of it, and they were like, you're fighting Israel? Yeah, we want to be a part of that. And we see that in Israel's history. Some believe that the chariots here may not have all been chariots of war, but hauling goods and luggage. It doesn't matter if they had radio flyers they were pulling behind them. You get 30,000 men pulling radio flyers. That can be intimidating within itself. Those squeaky wheels, come on. It didn't have to be, they didn't even have to be armed. Sheer numbers alone brought fear. To me, the thought of an enemy on foot that's, it's innumerable. We can't count it. That's an angered enemy. So now what? Saul, what now? He got their attention. Before the attack, did Saul ask counsel of God? Did Saul ask for victory? Did he seek God's will? Did he have an understanding or wisdom of what could happen? He poked the bear. Now what? It's an elementary lesson. There's too much at risk not to pray about it before we do it. If we're making decisions as men and women of our home, there's too much at risk to not know what God thinks about it, to just make it up as we go. There's souls at risk. Not even property. You can fail at that and file bankruptcy 10 times. I've seen people do it and still end up fine. How that works, I don't know. But there's too much at risk not to do it God's way. Never assume God's will. Know it. Don't assume God's going to bless it just because you're doing it. We got to move on. Verse 6. Keep in mind that 2 chapters ago, there was a great victory in Israel. And after that victory, Samuel called them together. And Samuel spent an entire chapter and a half, because the back half of that, he also was teaching, just telling them to follow God. So really, the last fight wasn't that long ago as far as in the way Samuel was addressing the people. And then this happens. Verse 6, when the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, for the people were distressed, then the people hid themselves in caves and in thickets and in rocks and in high places and in pits. They were literally so scared they were burying themselves. That's a fear I've never had to know. They were so afraid they buried themselves. They were in distress. This isn't how God's people were intended to live. It's not to mean it's going to be easy. It's not to mean that we're going to get the victory. It's to mean, how are they going to give God honor and glory hiding themselves in rocks and caves and pits? Hard times come. But to be made a coward with so much promise to you, knowing that you failed, that's a reason to hide. They feared, their spirits sank. They had a victory a couple chapters ago. Maybe they thought they were going to have God just doing it all for them without ever even asking him to. But the enemy's here now, and it's in great number. Saul's here. Where's Samuel? He was always around times before, but where is he now? You think maybe the people ran because Samuel wasn't there? You think Samuel could have kept them there? Why would they be looking around for Samuel when they see Saul? They wanted Saul. They chose Saul. Saul looked the part. They wanted a king. They specifically asked for a king that looked like a king. We want a king that looks like a king. They didn't say we want a king that's going to lead us wisely. We want a king that looks the part. Maybe at this point, some of them, God's revealing to them through wisdom, they realized they got just what they asked for. Someone who looked the part but was found lacking. Maybe they realized they had what they needed all the time. Do we ever see in Scripture where Samuel ordered an attack? Oftentimes it was a defense order, but not an attack. Did he ever put them in a position where they needed to be responded to? So now we see a people whose hope, or Saul himself said, no, today's the day of salvation. God has wrought salvation in our land. And now we see their hope is hiding themselves. They literally hid in the earth. Sin will make you hide. The longer we put off asking for forgiveness, the further we get from God. Sin will cause us to lose our focus. So we must guard against desire and what we want, what we give into, and who we follow. Who we allow to have influence in our life. There's a consequence to sin. The worst thing is it robs us of our courage and our joy. And by courage, I mean faith. It's hard to be faithful with sin. We won't turn there for time's sake, but Psalm 3:6 talks about faith, that it's an attitude, and it brings joy, and a joy from the Lord when our desires are focused upon Him. Let's close out here. Verse 7, it says, and some of the Hebrews went over Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. As for Saul, he was yet in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. Some started running from the enemy, and they just kept running. They leave their neighbors. They leave the king they asked for. They're in a foreign land because of fear. Those that stayed with Saul, those that followed him, were following him with fear and in trembling, expecting no other than to be cut off, for death to come perhaps. Saul stands there, though. Saul stayed there. So maybe Saul had courage for himself at this moment. But as a leader, courage for yourself is not good enough. You got to have courage for those around you. You got to be inspiring. You have to be encouraging. He needed to calm those around him when they saw themselves as weak. His back's against the wall. He's realizing maybe he made some mistakes. I think in closing, sometimes we just fail to think things through. It's not that we don't try. It's like when God brings a great victory and we're like, wow, I didn't think you'd bring it like that. I never saw that coming. Sometimes problems come the same way. It's like, where did that come from? I didn't even know that was going on. But I don't know that Saul ever had a desire to be a king. But to apply it to us, because we can learn from his mistakes, we have desires, and we fight them every day. And I'm not even talking about, as far as flesh desires, but even for power or for money or for authority. Do we need it? What are you going to do with it when you get it? Because it cost Saul, and it cost him his family in the end. What do we do? What do we do with the power or the authority that God's given us? Why do we deserve more? If our desire is to be a leader over here, well, you're a leader in your home right now. What are you doing with that power that God's given you now? Are you making the most of it? It's like praying for more money. Well, are you praising God? Are you blessing God with the things He's given you now? Why would He give you more if you're not using what you have given now? All right, so that was a little unorganized, but I promise you, hopefully next week it'll kind of start to make sense. So, Brother Nathan, would you close us out?